Welcome. Wherever you are in the world, we are recording this session today, and welcome to Rachael Thrash, to Ellen Heyting, our two presenters today, and to Keisha, who's joined us on this call. We're recording, so this will be put onto our media archives, but I'm just going to give a quick introduction to Rachael and Ellen, who are the writers and presenters and facilitators of the Cultivating Connections That Matter course. Rachael Thrash is from the International School of Helsinki, and Helen Heyting from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, have developed an online course for ECIS entitled Cultivating Connections That Matter, a toolkit for transformational teaching. ECIS members are entitled to access this course free as part of their membership benefits. And throughout the year, ECIS hosts open forums with Rachael and Ellen for interested educators to share and explore their facilitation of learning, which challenges students to develop their own meaningful answers to real-world questions. We have in fact had sessions this year also where some of the students had spoken about the course and the impact that it's had on their learning. But I'm going to hand you over first of all to Ellen, who's going to start off our session for us.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I might just share my screen if that's all right.
Yeah. Let me just give you screen sharing. There we go.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay, great. So I think Rachael and I, before we begin, we'd like to do a brief acknowledgement of country. So, we wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land I'm presenting to you from today, also known as Melbourne, Australia. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as we're all in different spots, I think, around the world listening in, and people will be listening to this, recording from many different lands. So we'd like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land from wherever you're joining us today. And also a special welcome to any Indigenous viewers who might be either joining us today who access this recording later on. So thanks for allowing me to do that, Sarah. So yeah, I guess we're here to talk about cultivating connections that matter, this toolkit that Rachael and I have put together in our time working together, that we found really transformed our teaching, and we found was a really useful tool to work with other colleagues and other groups of teachers or individual teachers in putting together units that really punch, I guess. And Rachael and I met each other working in the International School of Helsinki. We worked together for 4 years, I think, and it's probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that now that we met. And I think we've continued to sort of revise and make this toolkit even better as we've gone on and adapted it to what the world has thrown at us as in the last few years. And we just sort of have found that it's really led to units that students connect with and really drives their learning forward. So today we'd like to sort of walk you through this toolkit and also sort of talk about how we're finding it particularly relevant working with students in the world today and the challenges that we're dealing with in our classrooms. So this is sort of the outline for the toolkit, and we're going to walk through maybe these 6 stages. And when Rachael and I were putting this...
Ellen, can I jump in for just a second?
Please.
I also do want to introduce myself. I'm Rachael Thrash, yes. And I'm currently the director, the lead connected learning specialist at the International School of Helsinki. I'm also still in the classroom. And I was recently at the ECIS Leadership Conference with students who had the benefit of the kind of teaching that we're about to talk to you about and encourage you to try. And these students are just so empowered. And really what we're talking about is how to help students find their voice, how to help students think about the world around them and not feel overwhelmed by it, but rather feel that there's an opportunity for them to make a difference. And what we're finding, as Ellen just noted, that we started this work a number of years ago at our school in Helsinki, it's had residual impact. So it's starting to go from one curriculum and branching out and helping more people find a voice and find an inroad into their empowerment. And so it's exciting. And today we're going to share the different pieces with you just briefly, but of course, all of this can be found in the course that is available through ECIS as well.
Yeah, and I should also say what I'm doing now. I'm working at a university in Melbourne, Australia, and doing educational research and working with pre-service teachers. And I have to say that, you know, transitioning out of the K through 12 classroom into the university sphere, and a unit that I'm involved with at the moment called Transdisciplinary Pedagogies. And it's really been like a little bit of like, it's helped me really put the sort of academic weight behind this work, because everything that this unit goes through with these Masters of Teaching students is just sort of taken play by play out of this toolkit. So it's sort of, you know, really spurred me on with this work to know that it really is best practice. So we might start with the sort of, I guess, one of the units we'd like to use as a bit of a exemplar to sort of relate each of these stages back to. So Rachel, would you like to talk about this one?
Yeah, so the units that we are teaching are now really all based on this toolkit and the steps that you just saw on that beautiful tree. And if you're listening and not looking, we will be walking through those steps and introducing you to the idea of how you can use these different elements of unit planning to really help students find their own path, to differentiate, to inspire them. And we're going to be talking today about a current unit that I just finished teaching called How Do We Navigate Difference? So this year has been very challenging on everyone. I'm currently in Helsinki, and the region is really in disarray due to, you know, our neighbor has just invaded another neighbor. And as you can imagine, students have a lot to say about this. There's a lot of confusion. What are we going to do about it? A lot of disempowerment and fear. And so coming into somewhat luckily, we had a unit already planned called How Do We Navigate Difference? And this unit so beautifully helped our kids think about the work of peacemakers. So you could approach the war in the Ukraine and think, okay, let's look at all the causes. Let's think about it from the conflict perspective. But we were able to look at this as, how do you build tools for conflict resolution? And it gives kids a sense not only that there is a reason for conflict in the war, but there's also possibility of making change. And so this is an example of a young girl or a 10th grader teaching about peace to younger students. And we'll talk about it a little bit more, but this is kind of the context.
So sort of the first step we like to talk about when Rachel and I are talking about this toolkit is coming up with some kind of mission-inspired unit focus. So here, you know, when we talk about mission, we're really talking about either, you know, your personal mission as an educator, or maybe it's your school's mission, what it's really looking for from its students, or it could be, you know, something as broad as, you know, maybe the IB mission or something like that. So using that as sort of inspiration to come up with a bit of a hook or a engaging question that can get students interested in what this unit's going to be about from day one. So for this unit, we're going to be talking about the mission-inspired unit focus was, how do we navigate difference?
And we need, when we're thinking about this, I always like to work with other educators and say, okay, yes, we have our benchmarks and we know we're teaching maths or science and we need those disciplinary skills. But really, at the end of the day, when students walk away from this unit, how will they transform? How do we move from transactional teaching, where we're just giving them skills and tools, to transformational teaching, where they really think about the world differently as a result of your unit? And so we like to build this step into the very beginning of unit planning as we're considering that mission-inspired unit focus. What do you want your kids saying at the end of this unit? What do you want them thinking or feeling or inspired to do? And this is a really good place to start, because if you're thinking that big, then you certainly can build in the unit the disciplinary skills that are necessary to do this. You have so much fodder.
And this mission-inspired unit focus, this one sort of sentence or question that sort of captures student interest, we think it's so important because it really aims to link together these three important things for really transformational units. We think it should engage with some sort of global issue or, importance, something that's, going to impact the world in a positive way. But at the same time, it can't just be this sort of dry academic content. It's got to link with students' interests. We know how self-centered all of us are, but particularly teenagers or young people. So how can you connect it to what students are going through at either where they are in the world or their stage of life, or whatever the fad is going on at the moment, whatever it is. And then, of course, we have to be teaching them our disciplinary skills and knowledge base and all the academic tools they're going to need to succeed. So we argue that this mission-inspired unit focus really has to draw together these three key points.
And of course, we have external benchmarks, and we want to make it very clear that we're not moving away from external benchmarks. We're rather asking people to take the step further from them, to think in the big picture. When these are IB unit inquiry exemplars that we've pulled up, and it's hard to imagine saying water is essential to life and is a limited resource is going to be transformational to kids. It's important knowledge, but is it transformational? So we ask you to think a little bit beyond that. Why is that so important for kids to know? What could they be thinking about on a bigger level? Is it about sharing? Is it about equity? Is it about how are they going to process this in a way that resonates with them and matters for the way they look at the world?
So we sort of took over here on the left a few of these IB benchmarks, and we sort of reimagined them. So we still think by teaching these units with these mission-inspired unit focuses, we're still able to hit everything, external curriculums are asking us to hit with students, but maybe in a way that students can find it easier to connect to. So for example, instead of nations form alliances to protect their military, cultural, and economic interests, maybe it could be reimagined about a unit of how do we balance our needs with our morality? That's something instantly students can have an opinion on from day one and connect with it and can think about that question, how it resonates in their everyday life.
And they can also keep going back to it throughout the unit. I mean, when we have these really obscure wordy unit focuses, the kids lose track of it. And we all know then they're like, oh, this is the unit on World War II, which is, we want them thinking bigger. There's so much potential content out there. If we just bring it down to the really concrete, it doesn't change the way kids think.
So once we've sort of, got this big lofty goal or sort of interesting hook for the unit that students can relate back to themselves, we argue you should sort of meet that excitement and that big picture thinking on day one, the moment students walk into the classrooms, to start this unit with by inviting students into the unit and having some sort of activity that sparks student interest, gives them the sense of what this unit is about, but also sort of hands over the reins a little bit to students, that says they're important partners in this learning journey. And we want, to give them to make them know that this is not the same unit that we rehash year after year, but actually we're acknowledging, the individuals in the room as co-authors for this learning and inviting them to share where they're at the moment in their learning journey and what are the things that interest them, what do they really want to talk about and engage with. And then from that point on, see how we can sort of use that as fuel to sort of shape the unit as we go forward.
So in the unit that we're using here as kind of our case study, how do you navigate difference? We designed this really fun activity for kids because as we're talking about how do you navigate difference, there's very many reasons that people could come from different perspectives. And so we asked kids, these were 10th graders, they might not like being called kids. We asked these young adults to consider their own cultural backgrounds and how that might cause some differences in the way that they perceived just regular everyday scenarios. And we wanted to exaggerate their cultural differences. And a lot of our kids are very multicultural. So, they might have one parent from 2 different places, another parent from another. So we said, think about one of your grandparents. And this also helped us think about generational difference and the conflict that that can sometimes cause. And then they embodied this person. So first they had the fun of kind of introducing themselves, as I started off by being Al Wallenberg, one of my grandparents, and I kind of gave his background, and all the kids got to do that. So they're really kind of living in their own cultural background and sharing it and having fun doing it. And then we put up a number of different scenarios. So things as simple as you're going to the market and you're going to buy some shoes, and the shoes are 100 euros. How is your grandparent going to respond to this? And so we had these really interesting situations where one kid is saying, my grandparent would just walk out the door, and another one saying, my grandparent would start bargaining, and another one, she would be shy. And then we were able to say, okay, how could that potentially lead to conflict, or how could we change situations so it was more comfortable? And then from there, we began to dive into some of the cultural conflict they feel as international students who are getting a different experience with their grandparents who are maybe traditionally from Poland and have a more traditional framework of how to interact. They could talk about some of those conflicts. So to beginning a unit on navigating difference, we already established that differences aren't about right and wrong, but that differences are coming from many different backgrounds and culture and diversity. And so we have this built into the unit from the kids' experience, rather than us putting up the material as we've curated it.
So I think maybe something that we'd like to flag or head off, and maybe some questions we often get about this sort of stuff is, okay, but what if you get kids coming in saying, well, this is the way to do it, or this is the right opinion, or this type of stuff. There's often, particularly in the world in the last few years, there are really polarized opinions and political views out there, and we get them in our classrooms. But we're saying it's not something really to be afraid of or scared of, but it's something to embrace. And really, we want our students bringing their opinions and what they're hearing in other places, and to bring that as sort of fuel for discussion of the unit. Because if they're not sort of discussing it in this sort of safe space in this classroom with an educator there to guide them and help them explore those opinions and where they might come from and what they might lead to, they're going to go away and make some decisions, without that sort of guiding hand and without peers and other people to bounce ideas off and explore those opinions.
And also, this is one of those things that from the very beginning of every unit, if you're asking kids to share their opinions, you're setting up a safe protocol for how do we share opinions? How do we acknowledge that everyone has a right to a voice, and how do we manage difference? I mean, it's at the heart of this unit, but it should also be at the heart of a classroom so that kids can feel safe to explore, as opposed to getting even more stuck in our polarized worldviews.
So we've sort of so far walked you through, okay, we've got this big mission-inspired unit focus. We've talked about inviting students to the day one activity to build student authorship into the unit. We want to sort of jump to the end now and, start with the end in mind. So what is sort of the wrap-up big finale of the units? And Rachel and I have called this the performance of connection. Now, it's not really performance in the sense where, everyone's up on stage singing and dancing, but it's a way for students to share their learning publicly, or their synthesis of everything that's gone on in the unit with an authentic audience. So, what we're really talking about here, I guess we're really asking students to create something new, to put their unique spin on, the unit question, the mission-inspired unit focus. So, for example, how do we navigate difference? And to sort of, I guess, stand by that opinion or where they've come to at the end of this unit by sharing it with someone beyond just the teacher for a grade.
And I really think it's important to go back to that question: how will students transform as a result of this unit? And the performance of connection should give them an opportunity to show that they've done this. And so this picture here is these 10th graders are sharing the lessons that they can learn through global peacemakers with 5th grade students. In our community, we're having an issue with 5th graders getting into some conflicts on the football pitch. And they were really, for the 5th grade, a really tough situation. So we explained this to the 10th graders, and they had been studying conflict and difference. And we asked them to develop lessons that would show what are the important conflict resolution skills that experts around the world use in order to manage intractable conflict. And so they gathered lots of complex information and were able to express it in a more simplistic form so that they could engage the 5th graders in discussion and even do peace simulations with them. And you can see that there's full engagement here. Everyone is very excited about this work, and they're having discussions about what it means to improve peace in the community.
So the next sort of thing we like to talk about is sometimes with the performance of connection, you can see there how engaged everyone was in that last photo. And that sort of allows us to decouple assessment from these big performances of connection. So by providing an authentic audience, in this case, the 5th grade students, students are already super motivated to do a good job for this performance of connection and to put their all in. We would argue that it's not always the best place to be assessing students, because we're asking them really to take a bit of a risk with us, to engage in this new thing, to have a go at working with real people in real situations with new skills. And we want them to feel safe doing that. So we like to sort of reimagine assessment as sort of a stepping stone along the way in the unit, where it's preparing them for this performance of connection, rather than necessarily always being at the end of the unit and being this big scary thing that happens and then we don't talk about it and we move on to the next thing. But it sort of allows us then as teachers to sort of be coaches or guides next to students, offering feedback, as we go throughout the unit with this, because we've got this big shared goal of the performance of connection and working with real community members to improve, outcomes.
So in this unit, they were studying this unit in both INS and language and literature. And so in INS, they were learning about they were learning about conflict, and actually they used the Cold War as the basis of their initial study. But then they dug into individual peacemakers, and they did their own research project on those peacemakers, and they were assessed and helped along by a different colleague than Ellen's no longer with us, but so that they really had an in-depth understanding of people like Mo Mullen, which we saw in the beginning, and their impact on the world through their peacekeeping. Then they presented, but on the language and literature side, I brought this more internal. I had them work with this Working It Out handbook of negotiation and for high school students. Sometimes in language and literature, it can be really important to use an expository text. And then they did this interesting thing where they looked to their own conflicts in their lives or their own places where they were struggling to have communication, and they engaged in proactive conflict resolution. So then they reflected in writing on what they learned. And so you can read, I love this conclusion that this student wrote, but students engaged in conflict resolution with their parents over curfews, with their siblings over sharing a room, with another student in the class with whom they had had trouble negotiating any kind of a group work and grading, with grandparents over not wanting to get a vaccine. I mean, they applied it in all different interesting ways, but this girl, I'll read it out loud. She writes, in conclusion, I think I learned a lot about useful negotiation skills. I'm very pleased with the results of our discussion, as we do not have to worry about morning disagreements anymore, and our family dynamic is back to normal. I doubt I would have sat down to have this conversation if it wasn't for this assignment, as confrontation is not something I enjoy, but I'm glad I did. From this experience, I determined that listening to the opposite side's perspective while keeping an open mind is key. Trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes not only allows you to see what they might be thinking, but also to question your own actions in a different context. It acts as a barrier against positional discussions, misunderstanding, and severe emotional distress. In addition, I concluded keeping shared values highlighted should be a priority. It creates a connection between two sides, promoting in-group thinking and showing you are not negotiating to win, but to reach a common goal. It removes the need for defensive mindsets, aggressive behavior, and blame. Blame is a negotiator's worst enemy, as it only divides parties and largely stems from an instinctive emotional response. Blame prevents people from engaging in healthy, accountable behaviors, as no one will accept responsibility for problems if they believe they will be punished. And she writes more, but what I really love about this example, and many of them, I mean, I wish I could share all of them. They were so amazing how kids were using their writing skills and their analysis skills to break down their own experiences. But this girl had been so bothered that her parents were trying to make her eat a healthy breakfast every morning. And through their negotiation, her parents came to this recognition of, you're now a young adult and we were not giving you the credit that you deserve to make your own decisions. And they arrived at all new communication skills. And this is what, at the best of what we can hope is happening in our classroom, really changing the world for kids and how they operate in it.
So the next sort of stage that we like to talk to, and I guess this is not so much a stage as something that sort of gets embedded throughout the units that Rachael and I like to teach, is we think it's really important to include some form of community or service connection. So this can take the form of, getting your students out into the community. It can also be about inviting the community into your classroom. So it can be things like field trips or visits to labs or excursions, trips, as well as sort of inviting experts in to come and talk to your class, or going to visit other members of the community. Maybe it's a parent's workstation, maybe it's going to work with grade 5s as the example in this unit. But sort of, I think sometimes we get stuck, particularly if we're working in some curriculums that have service requirements about it's always got to be service, or that service always has to be this big sort of global thing. But sort of, we like to broaden it more to think about engagement with the community rather than just purely service for service's sake. Often service works really well for a lot of these units, but we don't try to shove it in there or make it fit where it doesn't always necessarily fit. Anything else?
Actually, yes. When we think about service, sometimes I've spoken with many colleagues who get frustrated and they'll say, our kids aren't really interested in doing service, or I don't know how to apply the learning they're doing to service without it feeling like it's not as complex as the learning that's happening in the classroom. And what I want to remind people is oftentimes a form of connecting kids to service is to say, okay, you're working on this complex mathematical skill or this complex idea of science. Bring a change maker into your classroom. And now, of course, with Zoom, this is much easier to do, who is using that learning as a tool. And then your kids can be asking informed questions of this person that derives from the unit and disciplinary understanding that they have, but they can still see that there's a reason why they're learning these skills if they want to be a change maker. Also thinking about sometimes not everyone has enough time in their classroom to be doing the community service, but if you're bringing it up and applying it to your units to bigger global issues, kids can also do this in programs like advisory. We're playing around with this a lot at ISH, or the International School of Helsinki, that they can get prompted and understand some of this work in your classroom and then find other avenues, student leadership, advisory, where they can dig further into the community service. But it's your responsibility to help them see why their skills matter. And that's the really important piece about this community service connection.
And then the last piece of our puzzle, I guess, is reflection. And we think it's super important to have some form of reflection in all of our units. But we acknowledge that reflection can be sort of a bit of a dirty word in education these days, and students often groan when you say it. But I think not so much in our classrooms anymore. We've sort of changed what reflection means with students. And I think we've gone away really from traditional forms of reflection. I think when students hear that word, they often think it's some big, lengthy written piece that I have to do. Whereas Rachel and I really try to mix it up and have different forms of reflection based on what the unit is and what other experiences they've had throughout the unit. So, you know, sometimes reflection should be written, but sometimes no. Sometimes it's, you know, a discussion piece, or sometimes it's, you know, a visual piece that they're creating. Sometimes it's private, you know, and doesn't have to be shared. Sometimes we really encourage public reflections. Sometimes it can be a group activity, you know, a discussion in small groups or whole class. And sometimes it can be just individual as well. So we look for as much sort of variety in reflection as possible. And just, you know, and this is an example that comes actually from my university classroom last week, when I was just finishing up a unit with pre-service teachers, so who are about to head into the classroom as graduate teachers, on embedding Indigenous perspectives in education. And I did the exact same activity that we asked you all to do a little bit earlier about. I asked them to think about their, you know, their classrooms as they're going in as graduate teachers. And when they've had students under their care for a full year, in terms of teaching for reconciliation. So in terms of working with Indigenous perspectives in their classrooms, when those students leave their care after that year, you know, what do they want their students saying and thinking and feeling and doing? And this is just one example of what they want their students doing. And there's lots of things in there that I know that these pre-service teachers that I was working with, when they came in the door with me at the beginning of this unit, they weren't doing these things. So it's been a wonderful reflection piece. Not only, you know, I can see the learning growth in these pre-service teachers, but also a great piece of data for me to think, okay, the learning activities we've engaged in this semester have really hit home. They've really impacted these teachers.
And I want to make one more point about this reflection, but by getting the students to write down or vocalize what's happened in the unit, they're more likely to hold on to it. I mean, a lot of research supports this, but Ellen's pre-service teachers, they've written it down and they've said, I am going to hope that my students will learn from or consult with Indigenous elders. Now they've sort of publicly pledged to do this. It's much more likely that it will actually happen. And the same goes for our students in the classroom, giving them an opportunity to be proud of what they've done, recognize it, think about it, go back to the beginning of the unit and think what I got from the beginning to the end, then kind of allows them to hold on to this, to put it in their backpack and say, this is now part of my learning profile and I can claim this. And oftentimes, so if you think about it that way, students sometimes want to do the reflection because they want to be proud of their work. If they're so excited about that peace lesson with grade 5s, for instance, which they were so fired up. My reflection with them was individual conversations to say, tell me how that went. And they were like, well, that kid loved this and he applied it to the problem on the football pitch because of this, and this part of my lesson went well, and now I really believe this about teaching peace. And so giving kids kind of a vehicle to talk about their learning is just a really important part of the reflection.
Right, it becomes less of a chore and more of just a celebration of their journey and their learning.
And then we often come to this question about time. Yes, this is aspirational. And I know that there's so much professional development out there and ideas about best practice. And sometimes it can feel like, how am I supposed to get all of this in? But what we would argue is it's been a really, really hard year. And as a person who has one foot in the door in teaching and one foot in the door of being in the administration, again and again, it was my students' responses to these units that kept me afloat this year, because their enthusiasm, their creativity, the units, as Ellen mentioned in the beginning, are new every time. There's never a stale unit that's being pulled out, because I can plan prompts in advance, but each kid in that classroom has a different response to it, a different way of managing it. Their personalities come across, and it's always exciting and new. And it's not necessarily more time, it's just how you're using the time.
And so that's kind of it. That's sort of an outline of our toolkit and sort of how it applies to one unit. So Keisha, we want to, thank you again for your time, and hope there were some gems in there that will be helpful in your context. And yeah, we'd love to hear any thoughts or questions or anything that came up.
Thank you both. As I listened, there were a couple of things that were definitely affirmed in terms of being connected to existing work that's out there, right? So while the words may not be exact, we're seeing that UBD approach of, okay, what are we hoping the end to be? And then how do we backward plan for that to happen? But we're also, I was able to see this idea of classrooms without walls, which is how I like to talk about my classrooms when I had 3-year-olds, and how I still like to talk about the work that I do with adults, with educators in classrooms, right? It can't be a list of transactional tasks. Like, how does this impact me and my position in the world? And how does this help me to contribute to the world in which we exist? So I was really appreciative of hearing the way it's designed, and also to see examples, real life examples of how they've impacted the work that your students are doing in their own learning, and that residual impact that's showing up at the end of the class, at 2 weeks after, a year after, however long after, right? They're taking with them, not illustrative content of which year did this happen, but what were some of the factors that informed this event in time, and how might we approach it differently? And of course, my favorite example was the breakfast conversation. As the mother of a recent high school graduate, yeah, she has, like many of your students, learned a lot more negotiating skills than I had when I was growing up. So it really is inspiring to see that or learners in the classroom are being recognized as contributing members of society, regardless of their age, right? We have a responsibility of helping them to be the best that they can be. And that does not include checking for grammar and spelling and listing history dates, right? So much more. So I appreciated the compelling questions that open up the conversation for their own connections to be made. Yeah, I definitely saw the transformational part of this particular unit or approach to unit design.
Thank you, Keisha, and thank you for being our audience. I can see that we would have a lot to discuss if we could ever be in person. But you're so right, and when you bring up that piece about grammar, it's so interesting. I don't know if anybody read there was an article over the weekend about the Calkins reading method in the New York Times, and it's kind of about this interesting push between phonics instruction or kind of whole language, and of course it's both, right? Like it's not as if the grammar isn't important, but when kids are trying to capture this really complicated discussion with their parents, that for them, it's kind of funny that it's about a breakfast issue, but for them, this is how their day starts every day. And it's something they were stuck on. And so she had an opportunity to dig into it. And then she's working out how to express this well and capture it. And we're going back and forth because she's saying, how do you do the quotations? How do I make sure the next paragraph, right? All those things. She is so invested in this topic. She wants to make sure that she is presenting it as well as it can be presented. And that's where Ellen was referring to the teacher being the guide or the mentor, as opposed to me dictating all the information. I can give a mini lesson on quotations, but it's almost more important that I say, if you want some help on how to do this, here's a great resource. You can check it out on your own time. I can give you feedback, but let's make sure we're representing your work well. And this is the beautiful part about teaching in a time when all those resources for this more rote information are available, but helping kids have curiosity about them and want to fit them into the learning has become our job more than just presenting them the information.
And I think now she's had such success with, the topic that's really been of interest to her. She's learned all of these skills and she's practiced and she's got, you know, the quotations down and everything. And so now when she's presented with the next opportunity where maybe the topic is, you know, maybe with a little bit more weight or importance beyond her family dynamics, she'll feel so confident and prepared to tackle that, knowing she's got the skills and the experience to do this well.
And that's why the title "Cultivating Connections That Matter" is so right, isn't it? It is about having that toolkit to be able to make connections that, as young people and older people are continuing on that journey of exploring the ladder of inferences and all of those influences that we have, but what you're encouraging is that they're doing this consciously. They're making connections between what they're doing. It's authentic so that they can use it and apply it in the next situation. They're not stuck in a system which is about having to learn for learning's sake in order to be able to jump through hoops. So this is where, when you were talking earlier on, Rachel, about that fear of, well, how am I going to get all this done on top of everything else I need to do? You know, what you're both, I think, pleading for is, let's not do things on top. Let's change the way that we're thinking, perhaps, in order to be able to make learning authentic, make learning relevant, be able to make those connections. You talk about changing how we think, and of course, therefore, also changing what we say, how we feel, and what we do, as in those really important words that you brought in there, as part of that big picture thinking. And I love that terminology that you use of inviting the students to take part in that, to engage in that learning journey, to engage in the unit you were talking about, rather than we're getting them to do something. We're inviting them to do something. And I think there's a very, very big difference there, which is why you refer to yourselves also as facilitators, rather than that sort of supposition that I'm your teacher, I've got the knowledge. If you're all quiet and sit quietly in your desks and at your desks and listen, one day you'll be as clever as I am. I don't think that, I think we're preaching to the converted there, but that you talk in terms of being facilitators, and I think that this is really representative of what you do. I'm going to mention, because you talked a little bit about this, rather than service, talking about engagement within the community. And I think this is a really important aspect of what you're doing here as well. There's something a little bit sort of paternalistic about service learning, potentially, in that what we're encouraging people to do is to go out there and help all of those poor people out there. And what you're talking about is not going out to change somebody else's life, but engaging in a relationship there within the community. And so I'm going to do a little plug here, because ECIS is working in partnership with the International School of London on developing a really exciting opportunity for young leaders in schools. And there are about 5 schools that are going to be involved in our first conference, which will be an online conference on the 15th of October, and then a follow-up, hopefully face-to-face, we'll see what happens, but in April next year, which is called Change Through Partnership. And students from schools around the world are participating in this together. The idea being exactly what you're talking about, that we're looking at partnership in changing and making difference and being co-authors in our learning. So huge thanks to you both for this presentation, and we will continue this conversation. Just to mention again that the online course of Cultivating Connections That Matter is available to member schools. It's on the ECIS website as part of the benefits package. So thank you to those participants through this year who will no doubt be taking advantage of taking a look at this session, but also anybody else that is interested in getting in touch with both of you. We're most grateful for your time today, and our conversation will continue because our partnership together, ECIS and you, through the work that you do with Cultivating Connections That Matter, is very important. Thank you.
And Sarah, I might just put our contact details up there if anyone who is listening or who has gone through the course and wants to engage in this and, you know, connect and talk more about it. They're welcome to get in contact with Rachel or I through our website, or you can find us on Twitter or any other ways. Our emails are up on the website as well. So.
And the website, of course, can be accessed through the ECIS website. It's on our courses page. And Ellen and Rachel also offer bespoke courses for schools that want to be able to go more deeply into this in their own context. So looking at it from their own closer perspective.
And thank you, Keisha. We really appreciate your participation as well.
Thank you.